Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. It's been a year since 12 Dallas police officers were shot by a sniper, 5 of them fatally, at demonstrations against the use of excessive force by police officers. Tributes were held around the country Friday in honor of those lost. We're honored to welcome former Dallas Police Chief David Brown. He's written a book. It's called Called to Rise. Welcome, Chief. I want to start with a year ago what you said after the shooting, which was you said that society's asking the police to do too much. Is that still true?
It's still true. You know, when a third of our prison population suffer from mental health issues, and basically the prisons aren't meant to be mental health providers, and that translates to cops having to deal with people who are mentally ill, who we don't have the training for that, and we just kind of by default take on that task.
Have any police answered this call that you put out a year ago, or legislators? I mean, have they heard you? Are there places where police departments are getting the load lifted off them because people recognize the point that you've made?
John, it seems that every time we see some progress, take a step, there's 2 steps we take back with another viral video or a court proceeding that didn't end in the way I think the public expected. And so we stay divided in this conversation about the role of policing in the 21st century, and particularly in communities of color.
Mm-hmm. Your book is such an insight into what life as a police officer is like, and I want to get to that in a minute. But since you raised the viral videos and the news events, and what do you say to those in the communities like the one you grew up in, right, where people see these court rulings and they say, you know, the policeman seems to get off free from one of these incendiary events? What's your response to that?
That officers are willing to sacrifice their lives for these communities, that they give their all, particularly white cops. It's still, in many departments, a majority white officers are on the police force, and they go into these communities and they risk their lives. Just this week, we had a really bad time for policing with the officer in New York and the officer in San Antonio being shot and killed in the line of duty by ambush, by suspects. And so there's no question that the cop on the beat is sacrificing and committing their life to protect all of us, including communities of color. But at the same time, I don't think there's a contradiction in saying that communities of color do get treated differently by those few officers that don't deserve to be in the profession. And there's a small number, but for these communities, this becomes their worldview.
First, from the side of the police, one of the stories you tell in your book about the mindset of what it's like to be a police officer, where you see threats where regular civilians don't. And I love the story you told about your mentor that you still had lunch with, a veteran, a retired police officer, and why he chooses to sit the way he does.
Right, so cops deal in possibilities, obviously, and we obviously can be perceived as very paranoid about what's happening, even at a restaurant, at dinner with a friend. We want to sit with our backs where we're facing the door and can see who's coming in. Even though retired cops, 80-year-old gentleman I have lunch with, he's always the first inside so he can have that perfect seat. He's been retired long, and again, it is the paranoia, almost a hypervigilance that's required to make it through your shift, to stay alive as a cop.
So if that's the mindset people need to learn that police have and to do their job, how do police learn about the mindset of the community? What's the solution there in terms of getting, to walk in the other person's shoes? How do you solve that?
I'm a big proponent. In my book, I describe how I transformed to a community-oriented policing type of police chief, because without the community, we cannot be successful in the best ways to protect it, because the community's priorities should be the police department's priorities. We're public servants. We should be serving these communities.
Yes, you got the kitchen, Operation Kitchen Sink. You were skeptical, though, at first about community policing.
Very much so. Actually, kicking and screaming, I went to a community policing assignment. I was hired on in 1983. This was the war on drugs, the height of the mass incarceration. So I came into the profession believing that, let's put them all in jail and let God sort them out. And what I understood later as I matured in the profession is that there's only so much jail bed space, and that mass incarceration is not, first, affordable, nor is it smart, because you have to make a distinction between people who are mentally ill, drug addicted, so that we can have space in jail for people who are truly violent and would hurt all of us and need to be in jail. But if you mix them all in the same bag, you don't have enough jail-based space. It's not practical to do that.
And the only way to really figure that all out is if you're there day to day, having these kind of relationships where you see people where they live before there's a crisis.
Right. I try to say things to cops and to citizens like this. Policing is the people business. It's not the enforcement business. And if you take away people from this formula, you lose the very nature of what policing is supposed to be about. We're supposed to be protecting people.
The number of shootings of police officers is up. What's your sense of what's happening right now in the relationship? You write also in your book about how both after Columbine and your own experience, I think it was Arizona Street,
yes,
where the firepower you were facing was of a different kind.
I think we've taken 2 steps back when it comes to the safety of our police officers. They don't feel supported. And I'm also encouraged, though, that there are numbers of citizens who openly express that they support police officers. And that's not giving the cops who don't deserve to be in the job a pass. We still need to be held accountable, but the vast majority of cops do the job the right way, and they deserve our support.
There was a Pew study at the beginning of the year that found that 72% of police interviewed said their colleagues are now more hesitant because of that, what you described. Before we go, I want you to tell one last story, which is about an experience you had that changed your life when you were young, about a guy named Mike. Tell people that story.
Yes, Mike Schillenberg. Real quick story. In 6th grade, I was part of busing, desegregation in this country, and I was bused to an all-white school. Mike Schillenberg was a white kid, and obviously you can tell I'm black, and we were both 11 years old, and he invited me home for dinner because he saw the difficulties I was having in school, and that transformed my worldview of race. Because Mike's mom brought out 2 pot pies, and we sat and had dinner, and we became best friends. We're friends today. And God knows what I would be thinking about people if Mike hadn't invited me home for dinner. So again, my takeaway is, see you at dinner. Let's not be so divided.
All right, Chief Brown, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, John.
And we'll be right back with our political panel. We're joined now by our political panel. Margaret Brennan is CBS News White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent. David Ignatius is a columnist at the Washington Post. Michael Crowley is Politico's senior foreign affairs correspondent. And David Nakamura covers the White House for the Washington Post. Margaret, I want to start with you. Welcome back from the trip. What was the administration's view of this meeting with Russian President Putin?
Well, the administration believes now that they've checked the box. They've handled the issue of Russian hacking by speaking directly to Vladimir Putin. The only account of that meeting was described to us by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. He was the only other administration official in that very small meeting. And as described by Russian officials in their on-camera press conferences, both from their foreign minister and Vladimir Putin, they said President Trump accepted their denials and that agreed to move forward. Secretary Tillerson says, well, yeah, we agreed to move forward. And the majority of the meeting then went on, he says, to focus in on this first test of U.S.-Russian cooperation in Syria and this limited ceasefire in the south of the country that went into effect today.
I want to get back to that Syria in a moment, but David Nakamura, you wrote about this week other presidents who'd met with President Putin. Continue to put this meeting in the context of history.
Well, you know, I think what's interesting is Putin has sort of really soured on U.S. relations. We know that under President Obama at the end of George W. Bush, they had tried to get off to a better start, but he was very frustrated, and he was known from the people I talked to begin meetings with a litany of complaints about U.S. actions undermining Russian cooperation. I think there was a little bit of a different element here at play where he sort of recognized the challenges that Donald Trump is under politically, and to some degree, it's interesting. We don't know who set up the terms of this meeting, the so few participants, and the idea that both sides came out spinning sort of proactively on their behalf. But what we do know is that President Putin has gone on camera and had, as Margaret said, a press conference, and Foreign Minister Lavrov has as well. The U.S. side has not done that. You have senior administration officials, some on the record, some not, disputing some of Putin's characteristics of this meeting. But this morning you have Donald Trump again saying that the Russian leader denied it, denied the meddling, but that I, Donald Trump, I've already said what I have to say about this. Let's move on. And that's just not enough.
David Ignatius, the president seems from his tweet this morning to want to move on from this question of interference. Senator McCain says if you move on and the Russians pay no consequences, they'll be emboldened. That's certainly the way President presidential candidate Donald Trump talked about it. It's the way Secretary of State Tillerson talked about it at his confirmation hearing. If they see weakness, they're emboldened. What do you make of the kind of state of play right now with respect to this interference?
Sanctions against Russia are still in place. Contrary to what Senator McCain said, President Obama did impose additional sanctions for the hacking on December 29, expelling Russian diplomats, closing 2 of their compounds. Those are not, so far as we know, being returned. They're still in place. So there are no additional sanctions for now, but none were taken off as a result of this meeting. This summit was just fascinating to see the U.S., the former President Trump, so isolated from our traditional allies, where people were talking about the G19 versus the U.S. on climate change, and then this extraordinary rapprochement with Vladimir Putin, accused by our intelligence agencies of attacking our elections, and the president basically saying, you know, it's time to move on. We won't move on until Robert Mueller has delivered his investigative report. That's what's going to resolve this, along with the congressional hearings.
Right, and even go ahead, Margaret.
I would say, to your point, one of the best sort of contrast to this would be to look at the French president when he met with Vladimir Putin, who, yes, they had a meeting, let's talk about working together, but in public came out and directly said, I don't like where they are on human rights, persecution of gays, issues of election hacking, etc., and stood up to at least say, here are our values that we don't like you undermining. Secretary Tillerson, on the other hand, described this meeting and chemistry between President Trump and Putin as positive. They couldn't stop talking. The First Lady had to barge into the room to say, can you wrap up the meeting? And then they kept talking for another hour. The optics are troubling to our European allies because of that degree of positive chemistry.
And Michael Crowley, this morning the president is tweeting about this cybersecurity unit that's getting some tough reviews. Senator Rubio tweeted, partnering with Putin on a cybersecurity unit is akin to partnering with Assad, the leader of Syria, on a chemical weapons unit.
Yeah. Well, or one thought I had would be a maritime security cooperation arrangement with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. I mean, they came in, the Russians hit us really hard. It's not clear whether they were able to influence the outcome of the election. We know that there was the integrity of the vote. Votes were not changed. But I think despite Trump's repeated assertions, you can't say for sure that the Russian propaganda that made its way into the U.S. and the theft and release of embarrassing emails from the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, you can't say that they played no role. So I think that it's very troubling for a lot of people in Washington, in the Congress, possibly even in Trump's own administration, to see his response to this is we need to work together. And John, I would add that in that press conference that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had when he talked about this, he said that, you know, as we move forward and we have this cooperative relationship, both sides are agreeing not to interfere in each other's affairs, which I think is a real concession to Vladimir Putin, who feels that Hillary Clinton helped to mastermind popular protests against him in 2011. And indeed, many people believe that created a grudge where Putin was out to get revenge against Hillary. There's basically no evidence that the State Department or the U.S. government whipped up those protests. That was genuine popular dissent. This is essentially a Kremlin myth that Tillerson and Trump may have implicitly endorsed.
David, one thing that seems confusing here in terms of the president's posture is, on the one hand, he blames President Obama for having choked, having not held the Russians to account for this interference in the election. But now the president would like to move on and is forming a cyber unit in cooperation with the Russians.
I mean, it's political jiu-jitsu, and he blamed, right on this trip, he blamed President Obama again for not doing enough. So he wants to have it both ways, and that's not going to satisfy people on Capitol Hill or others in the media who I think really want to see not only Robert Mueller's investigation play out, but also whether the president will take accountability and follow up on some of the, sort of additional sanctions that some in Congress are pushing.
David Ignatius, the Syria agreement, and Margaret, I want to get your take on this too. So that's one of the things that came out of this meeting, but also we have what the Secretary of State said about Syria, which is, again, he said, by and large, our objectives, he's talking about the Russians here, are exactly the same. How we get there, we each have a view. Maybe they, meaning the Russians, have got the right approach, and we've got the wrong approach.
I have no idea what Tillerson meant by that. It's a strange comment, and Senator McCain was right. The Russians have been associated with an absolutely barbaric campaign by President Bashar al-Assad. Tillerson also said that the U.S. expects, and it was implied that the U.S. and Russia expect, that President Assad will leave as part of a transition, and that the Assad family will leave power as this transition moves forward. I've just been in Syria 2 weeks ago, and what's obvious is that there is movement with the U.S. and Russia working together toward deconfliction, de-escalation, identification of the different parts of the country where there can be truces in effect. People stand down. That's real. It's been happening for weeks. And the reason that I have some confidence that this may have legs is because they've been testing it. One deconfliction line for the last 3 weeks. The agreement in the Southwest that Margaret made reference to actually was reached about a week ago, and they've been watching to see if it holds, and when it held, they decided to announce it. So maybe there is something there.
Margaret, what's your take?
And negotiated by American diplomats. Not necessarily in that room between the two heads of state. But what I think is interesting here is it's being presented as a test. But this is also a test of Russia in terms of can they actually influence and control Assad and the Iranian forces that are on the ground, because we don't negotiate as the United States government with either the Assad regime or with Iran. So paper agreements are nice. Let's see what happens. But as David was just saying, this has been tested. In some ways, this could be a lifeline for the U.S.-backed opposition in that particular part of the country. It could also be something that allows them to hold on to the governance structures that they've started to establish there. That might be a blueprint for the future, but it is so heavily caveated with, can anyone actually enforce this, that we'll have to see what happens.
All right, we're going to pause there. We'll be back in a moment with our panel on North Korea and healthcare. Stay with us. And we're back with our panel. Michael, I want to go switch to the issue of North Korea. Where do you think the administration's strategy is right now?
I think it's still actually a work in progress. John, one strange thing about Trump in North Korea is that there's some evidence that Trump's own advisors and officials are following his lead, that a lot of this policy has been laid out through his tweets. And Trump will tweet something, and it's not clear that the key players in his administration understand exactly what he means. For instance, recently, and he's done it now a few times, Trump tweeted that the Chinese had tried, he had exerted pressure on President Xi to do more to crack down on North Korea economically, and now has said, well, the Chinese tried and it didn't work, too bad, we're going to have to do something else. I'm not sure that Plan B is fully spelled out. It is clear that there are options for imposing more sanctions on Chinese entities that do business with North Korea, but this is and maybe that would have some effect, John, but this is something that the United States has been thinking about and talking about for many years. And the question is, what price will you pay in your direct relationship with China to try to solve the North Korean problem? And that relationship with China encompasses so many things. Economics, obviously, stability, military issues, cyber issues. Remember, Russia is not the only country that's messing around with computers. So there are not great options here. And I guess I would say the last thing is, when it comes to this question of what do you do with China, again, I think there's this sense in the United States that if only we can convince the Chinese that it's in their interest to do what we want them to do, then we can make some progress. They'll change their policy. And I just think the Chinese have a sense of their own interest. You can't just persuade them to do something. It will require probably some kind of tough economic measures that are going to exact a real cost, and I just don't know whether Trump is
there. You have a couple things in play here, though. The administration did follow up through Treasury to sanction a Chinese bank in the Dandong Bank. People in the Bush administration I talked to suggested that is a significant step, a first step, maybe a more. They don't know how quickly that'll take effect. You also saw on the sidelines, it was fairly overlooked in Germany, but President Trump had this trilateral meeting with President Moon and Prime Minister Abe of Korea and Japan. And that's not a small feat. President Obama took a lot of effort to sort of get that kind of dialogue started. And these are two allies that we think are allies, but they themselves are not often on the same page. You had a Korean president who came in sort of running on more engagement with Pyongyang. You have the Japanese Prime Minister saying, no, we can't do that. We need more, tougher action first. So to get them in the room at least talking on the potentially on the same page as a start.
And China not in that meeting.
Not in that meeting.
David, what do you make of the UN ambassador saying countries that do trade with North Korea, which means China essentially, their agreements with the United States are not going to continue? Is that right, a trade war over this?
Well, she was mildly threatening economic action if China isn't more helpful. To me, the takeaway the last 2 days on North Korea is that the Trump administration has doubled down on its strategy of working with and through China to try to restrain North Korea. A week ago, we were all talking about military options, and the General Brooks in South Korea had us on the edge of war, it seemed. After the summit, we returned to this idea that China is our partner. The president said very nice things about China. The atmospherics of that meeting were very warm, and I thought that was the heart of what Ambassador Haley had to say. She added the little bit that we may stick it to them, but I think that where they're really going is to kind of reanimate that diplomacy.
And a lot of that is getting some of the smaller countries who have even guest worker programs with North Korea to cut off any kind of financial lifeline. But the biggest checks come from Beijing, which is why they're so relevant here. Secretary Tillerson did say that proposal of freeze for freeze, something that Russia and China seem to be supporting, freezing North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for the U.S. doing things like stopping the joint military exercises that we have with South Korea, are something that the U.S. administration is not receptive to at this time. They think it can't be a freeze, it has to be a rollback. In other words, North Korea needs to offer more before diplomacy really gets underway here.
But we don't have the leverage to force them to roll back right now, unless we start dropping bombs, essentially. And that is just the options here are good, ugly, and horrible. And again, I think that we've heard people talk for years about we're going to convince the Chinese to change their minds, and we're going to talk the North Koreans into this. You can't do it unless you're willing to start blowing things up, and that's a terrifying scenario. A lot of people start dying. The global economy gets rocked. It's a really tough problem.
One finally before we go, David Ignatius, you were in Mosul recently. There are now reports that Mosul has fallen from ISIS. What's your assessment of what's happening?
I want to be clear. I was actually in Syria and near Raqqa, which is also heading toward falling. John, the strongest emotional response I had was to see the faces of people who've been living under ISIS for 3 years as if they're coming out of a prison into the light, and they can't quite believe it. There's a little bit of optimism, but you can just see how painful this has been. The U.S. has found allies that have helped clear this territory finally. Number of Americans who've died in Syria and Iraq in the last 3 years as ISIS has been chased out of the major centers, 5.
Okay, that's got to be it. Thanks to all of you, and we'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.